So thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure, it's an honor, privilege to be here and talk to you this morning. My name is David Vernon. I work for Carnegie Mellon University, Africa in Rwanda. And I'm going to be giving you 3 classes. I hope you make it to the second and especially the third. You'll see what I mean when I show you what's coming up for the first. I'm going to give you an overview of cognitive architectures. Tomorrow we'll talk about memory. In particular, I'll focus on episodic memory, and then I want to introduce you to different design choices you have when you're developing cognitive systems and cognitive architectures, and introduce you to a new development in the field over the last couple of months, the last year. And it will kind of wrap up the whole thing. It'll put everything in context. Here's an overview of the 3 classes. This should scare you. It certainly terrifies me. What you'll notice is there's a few hidden slides up here because I realize I can never get through 350 slides without this happening, because we don't have any videos. Michael had some lovely videos, I don't have any, and I've only got a few images, so what are we waiting for? Now, some people have seen this before, and I expect this to happen pretty quickly for those people. Everybody else, well, do your best, and I'll wake you up if and when you do manage to fall asleep. It happens. It happens. Let's see. Okay, so for those of you who do manage to slip off and then come back, all of what I'm going to talk about is on my website. I have a course on artificial cognitive systems which I give. Most of the slides that we have here have been sampled from that, and there's a few extra ones that aren't up there yet. In any case, there will be a copy of this presentation on your website. And then there's a wiki as well that goes with it, with a lot of additional information that I offer. And if you're really serious about this, then there's a fantastic book that somebody called David Vernon wrote about 3-4 years ago. It was written expressly for people getting started in the field. It's not telling you how to build a system. It's telling you how to survey the world and the very, very disparate world of cognitive systems and cognitive robotics, both from robotics and from cognitive science and a little bit of neuroscience as well. So it's really a primer, which is exactly the point of the book. Okay, I'm supposed to be talking about cognitive architectures, but I want very, very quickly to give you some motivation for being here. This is what we want. Well, at least this is what Maria Petru wanted. When Maria Petru's great aunt was not impressed with her fantastic accomplishments in the area of robo-soccer, she said, well, why don't you do something useful with your life? And she said, well, what? Well, a robot to do the ironing would be very nice, thank you very much. Sadly, Maria is no longer with us. She died in 2012. She was a brilliant, brilliant computer scientist. And if she does nothing else other than remind us that this is tough as a challenge, she'll have done a great service. Okay, so there are 2 reasons why you would want a cognitive robot. And the first one is we would like it to do the ironing. We want it to work independently, being able to adapt to things that don't appear as they should appear, and anticipate events. But there's another reason why cognition is important, and it's that we want to be able to interact with people. It's not just getting robots to do stuff. It's getting them to do stuff with people as well. And cognition is an interesting thing because it facilitates interaction by humans. Humans love interacting with cognitive agents to the extent that they pretend that agents are cognitive even when they're not. They project onto it a cognitive capability even when it doesn't exist. But perhaps the other side of it then is that if you're a cognitive agent, you can infer what the human is trying to do as well, and that can be very important in collaborative work between robots and humans. So that's what I think about why people want to study cognitive robotics, but maybe other people don't. So we did a little survey a couple of years ago of industrialists, and we asked them what they wanted. And they want safe, reliable, transparent operation. They want to be able to instruct the robot at a very, very high abstract level, and particularly using kind of vague explanations and vague instructions. And we'll come back to that in a moment. It has to be able to acquire knowledge on an ongoing basis. It's got to be able to plan adaptively. Plans are plans. No plan has ever worked out. None of my plans have ever worked out. You always have to adapt and change. And you want the interaction to be personalized as well to the person that you're interacting with. You need to be able to assess what you're doing so that you can improve, and you'd love to be able to learn from demonstration. This is probably the most natural way of instructing robots to do something. And they have to infer what the goal is. You can tell them, but there's a lot of gaps they have to fill in. You want to be able to evaluate the safety of your actions. This is Leia. And this is Maya Rudinak's robotized, effectively a wheelie. And it's one of my favorite robots because it doesn't look like a robot. It's not a manipulator, but it's very, very clever, and it's got adaptive responses based on the way it interacts haptically with the user. You want robots to be able to develop and self-optimize. You have to be able to transfer knowledge, otherwise we're going to have to teach all the robots individually, and that's not going to work very well. And finally, the Holy Grail. We would love robots with which we can collaborate, and that means that they have to be able to infer what it is you want to do without you explicitly having to tell them. And then finally, on a very pragmatic level, Industry 4.0 is here, and it's really going to change the way that we work in the world. And as it says in this report, the Deloitte report, these systems are going to be highly cognitive and very, very autonomous. But remember, there's one other reason why people do all this. It's not just that they want the smart robot, it's also that they want to understand cognition. They want to understand what it is to be a cognitive agent. So it's not just purely practical. And Michael mentioned this, and this comes from Richard Feynman's Blackboard in Caltech. It's up here, what I cannot create, I do not understand. So it is the understanding by doing is the philosophy that underpins a lot of the work that we do in cognitive robotics as well. It's not just about making millions, it's about understanding humans as well. So the question then is, well, what is cognition? And so the best way to get an answer to that is to do a survey. There was a network that I helped coordinate a few years ago. We asked our members, we got 42 responses, and we got 42 different answers to the question, what is cognition? This was not a good sign. So there was clearly a lot of work to do to form a consensus. When that happens, what do? You invent your own. And so this is my definition of what cognition is. It's a process by which an autonomous system perceives the environment around it, it learns from experience, it anticipates. This is a crucial aspect, the outcome of those events, and it acts then to pursue goals. It's a goal-achieving behavior, but it has to be able to adapt as well. The anticipation turns out to be the crucial issue here. You need it all, but anticipation, this concept of prospection, about envisaging the outcome of your actions before you engage with them, is effectively what we're trying to do. And that's more than just planning. Planning is, I'd like this to happen. Anticipation is, well, if I do, this is what I think will happen. And it's not necessarily the same thing, because there are multiple possible outcomes. So to be able to look at a situation and understand what you should do. So cognition, if you can all go to sleep now, you've heard the most important part. Cognition is all about the future. It's about another sense which makes up for the fact that our perceptions are inadequate, because we can only perceive what's available, and what's available is usually insufficient for you to complete the task. So, a system that continually predicts the need for actions, this is what I should do now if I want to achieve my goal, and also I'm going to predict what other agents in the world around me are going to do. And then, of course, the most important thing, well, if that happens, then, well, what's the outcome? So, and then to be able to assess, is that what I really want, before you commit to that action. So this is my little cartoon to capture what we want in a collaborative, interacting agent, cognitive robot with a human being. There's one other thing I want to reinforce, is that in the old days, when I was studying computer science, we thought of cognition as a bit of a filling in a sandwich. We had perception, cognition, and action, and it was kind of a separate thing. That's still prevalent in a lot of schools, but it's not the way that I like to think of it. Cognition for me is an umbrella term, and it embraces everything that I've talked about. So cognition is about action. Cognition includes action. It's not purely reasoning, it's more than that. Because you've got to be able to make up for missing information, uncertain information that's just coming too late for you to do what you want to do. So you need to predict, you need to anticipate, and then make sense of the world by adapting to it. And Michael emphasized this, cognition is about effective action, however you define the word effective. By that phrase, effective action, comes from one of the people who started one of the main areas of cognitive science today in action, who was Francisco Varela. Okay, so, all right, I've taken up the first 5 minutes. Okay, so we now at least know why we're here. At least I know why I'm here. Whether you know why you're here is another matter. I now am going to do what I said I would do, and I'm going to give you a quick overview of cognitive architectures. The word overview, well, let's see how deep I can plumb. I'm going to give you breadth, and I'm going to give you samples of depth. And at some point, I'm going to do what every speaker does, is I'll skip over the next 10 slides. Right? I will try and resist the temptation, but I may have to. I have learned over the years to read body language. It's an essential survival skill for any speaker. And at some point, I may ask you to sit up straight, place your hands upright and push upwards. I will try and refrain to asking you to put a pen between your teeth. I'll explain all this at the end, because it turns out that this is an important aspect of cognition. The concept that your embodied state influences your mental state. It's not just the other way around. And if you do these things, you'll feel much better about life. Over coffee, I'll tell you a little anecdote why that didn't work when I was cycling one day. Okay, so architecture. Architecture is all about both the functional and the technical. And in particular, it's about integrating things into a whole. So it's more than just a diagram. That's the take-home message there. I also want to say a little bit about, in the context of cognitive architecture, is the complementarity of artificial intelligence and cognition. They're not the same thing. AI provides you with all of the tool sets, all of the technical stuff, all the science, everything you need here. Cognition is about behavior. It's about a particular type of behavior. It is sitting on this fantastic foundation, but it is after prospective action. It's about autonomy and your ability to interact effectively with humans. So they're very complementary aspects of the whole domain of robotics and cognitive robotics, but they're looking at it at different levels of abstraction. So just be aware of that. You cannot have cognition without AI, but you can use AI for a lot more than just cognitive systems. Now, if I want a cognitive robot, this is where I'm aiming for, Mount Everest. And that's not easy. And cognitive architecture is effectively your base camp. That's what, you cannot get to the top without base camp. It's not going to happen. And the bad news is there's a lot of work to get to base camp. Forget about getting to the top. Building your cognitive architecture, it takes a huge amount of effort and a huge amount of work. It's a very non-trivial exercise, as I see when I take you through a few of them. The other aspect is that the term cognitive architecture means different things to different people in different fields. Broadly speaking, and this is a kind of a pastiche of it, but you can break up cognition into three different classes. The cognitivist approach, the emergent approach, and then hybrid, people who try to get the best out of both worlds. Over in the emergent approach, we've got connectionist, dynamical, and inactive approaches. So I'll explain very briefly the difference, because it fundamentally changes the way you think about what does a cognitive architecture mean for me. The thing you also need to know is the term originated and is owned by the people in cognitivist systems. In particular, it originated with Newell's work in the early 80s and has been continued on by his research program, and subsequently stolen or appropriated or borrowed or, in the words of some, misused by other people in different domains. So it has slightly different meanings across the spectrum here, which I'll explain. So it all started with Newell, this idea. He introduced this concept of a unified theory of cognition. So he wanted to build a model of cognition that embraced everything. I'm not going to read them all out. You can read faster than I can speak, but effectively, a unified, complete view of what cognition is all about and what cognitive science is from every discipline. Michael mentioned this as well, that we're computer scientists, but we also better be aware of what cognitive scientists do and neuroscientists do. We've all got something to learn from this. So, from the cognitivist approach, which originally and I emphasize the word originally, was focused on symbolic reasoning and physical symbol systems. And that's changing now, as we'll see when, and I'll wrap this up on Wednesday when I say, well, what are the cognitivists saying now? They're saying something slightly different. Over the last 15, 20, 30 years, the field has matured. The core thing here about cognitive architecture is it's the thing in cognition which is constant over time and is task independent. It's the fixed part of cognition. It's not domain specific and it's not task specific. So if you want a task specific, domain specific system, what do you add? You add knowledge. So a cognitive model has two parts: the fixed part, the architecture, and the knowledge which populates it and gives it that domain specificity. And then in the past, knowledge has typically been determined by your designer, whether you are explicitly doing it or implicitly, and it can be augmented with machine learning. So then a cognitive architecture on that basis says, I will identify all the modules you need, I'll identify all the relations between them, and I will identify, and this is what's key, if you want a cognitive architecture not to be what we call a boxology. Boxology is a pejorative term, says I draw pictures, I draw arrows, and I have an architecture. You don't. What you have is an outline sketch of something which may make sense or not, depending. You must populate it at an algorithmic and representational level. A lot of people don't, and it's not done here. No disrespect to Alexei, but this is a conceptual thing, and cognitive architectures aren't conceptual. That's important. They're real. They are the blueprints by which we build our systems. So you've got to be able to address what kind of memory you have in your system, short-term and long-term, what kind of representations, what functional processes. And as Michael mentioned, you need a programming language because you want to be able to construct it, and you need to be able to get knowledge into it and out of it. And you need it to act as well. So there's got to be some kind of a programming language in that. And that embodies effectively the architectural assumptions. The nature of your language determines the representations and the processes and the memories. So there's a relationship between the two, but you need this. If I move over to the right-hand side of the spectrum then and talk about emergent systems, then in this particular case, the focus here is less about knowledge and more on development. It's about change. You start off in a primitive state, not being able to do much, and you end up eventually in a fully cognitive state. And, the models for this approach are very immature, frankly. The models for the cognitives are much, much more mature. And if I wanted to bet my house on anything, I wouldn't be betting it on this approach in any time future. However, if I was betting my children's houses on it, I'd be going this side. It's going to take time. But I do think, personally, here I'm just giving you a personal perspective, I think a lot of the hard questions are going to be answered from the developmental side, not just from the knowledge engineering side. I think we're seeing a little bit of this today by the ever-present, prevalent, and now actually quite boring presence of deep learning in just about every facet of life. It seems it's going to solve everything. I'm not so sure. Although it can solve some interesting things. And here I have to say, one of my areas of interest is visual attention. And visual attention is an old field. And in the last 5 years, it's completely changed. It's been revolutionized by convolutional neural networks. People don't try and come up with salience functions anymore. They teach them. And it's changed everything. And the level has just gone up. So you would dismiss deep learning at your peril. But you wouldn't want to make it every tool in your toolbox either. There's more to it than that. If you want to develop, then you'd better be aware of these two people, Jean Piaget and Lev Vygotsky. They've got two different approaches to how children develop. One is based on the individual, and he explores, and then the social interaction. So from a cognitive architecture perspective, then what is a cognitive architecture? It's what we call your phylogenetic configuration. It's what you get when you're born. Not what you get when you're conceived, that's epigenetics. It's actually after you're born, once you're out in the world, well, what do you do then? So you have certain innate skills, and you've got certain core knowledge. This is Liz Spelke. If you want to know anything about what you get as a neonate when you're born innately, Liz Spelke in Harvard is the person to go to. She gave a master class at a meeting that we organized a few years ago, and we videoed it, thankfully. And she just kept 80, 90 people in the palm of her hand for almost 2 hours. It rapt attention. It was the best talk I have ever come across. So I'm very glad we captured that for posterity. It's on the wiki. Okay, so I want cognitive architecture, so I wanted to have certain attributes. And the attributes have been cataloged by many people. Ron Sun is perhaps one of the most famous people in the area in Rensselaer, and he identified 3 particular attributes. And then depending on whether you're interested in development or functional capabilities, Pat Langley and Jeff Kritschmar identified a few others. I'm going to run through them really quickly because the reason I want to flag a few keywords which are going to come back when I talk about a specific cognitive architecture at the end. So I'm just setting the scene here for ticking some boxes later on. That's why I'm doing this. So realism, we just wanted to be real. We wanted to reflect the fact that there's an evolutionary background to it. It's got to be real in terms of accomplishing cognition as humans do it. And it's got to be ecologically real. That is, it shouldn't work just in a toy world. It's got to work in a real world. In particular, I picked this out because this is specific to what we are doing here this week in EASE. It's everyday activities. If it can't work there, it isn't ecologically real. We would also like it to be based on our models of animal intelligence, and we would also like it to be embracing all of the aspects of cognitive systems. And of course, like all good scientific theories, it should improve on prior theories and prior models. I have this one here, a behavioral characteristic, but we've covered it all already. It's all about acting, it's all about reacting, it's all about temporal sequencing, it's all about how do I put this together to achieve a goal. And you might have gradually learned routines, so you can learn and put these things together through trial and error. So learning is a core part of this. And that learning can be bottom up, it can be explicit symbolic learning, and it could be functionally modular, or it could be physically modular, depending on where you're doing it. Pat Langley has a long list of things that should happen. Ron Sun decided, well, my first list wasn't long enough, let's have a longer list. Actually, I wanted to pick out this here, the importance of interconnectivity between things. This is the communication, is really very important. These are elements of a system, a cognitive system. Maybe this system is more important than the cognitive. It's very easy to talk about all these attributes of cognition, but ultimately we're building systems. And anyone who's built a system knows how hard that is in an engineering way. It's really, really difficult. It's one thing to develop a new algorithm, it's quite a different thing to develop a complete system on which all of your elements are robustly assembled. Talking about assembly, this is Aaron Sloman's cognitive architecture. I show you this because this was one of the original ones, and Aaron has forgotten more than most of us ever knew in cognitive systems. He decided to refine that a little bit, and so he's got perception, he's got action, central processing. You can see he's a cognitivist. He's got reactive mechanisms, quick mechanisms, deliberative ones. What if I did that? And then some reflective processes. I show you this because this is actually quite indicative of the overall superstructure that many cognitive architectures eventually, by design or otherwise, ended up with. If you're interested in development, Jeff Kritschmar has a number of different desirable characteristics. You've got to have innate behaviors. The key thing that you've got to watch here is the value system. Because you're not programming it to behave in a certain way, it learns to behave. It's got to have something to guide it, and that guide is called a value system. And without it, it doesn't have an objective function, to use Michael's words from this morning. There's got to be some objective function which defines the dynamics of the system. Without that, you're going nowhere. And that has to be innate in it. So Ron Sun wrote a very famous paper called Desiderata for Cognitive Architectures, and then I thought it was a great idea, so I copied him. So we wrote our one, Desiderata for Developmental Cognitive Architectures. Doing okay, but yeah. So it's not going to be cited as often as Sun's, but flattery is, the best form of or impression, or what is it? Yeah, copying is the best form of a flattery. So Let's see where it goes. But if you want to know more about what a developmental system should have, we originally had about 36 of them, and nobody read the book. So we said, we've got to do better. So we got it down to 10, and now people are reading it. And it's actually having a great knock-on effect on the book. They're going back to read the other ones, which is good. A key thing I want to talk about, though, is you've got to talk about functionality, the interconnectivity, and you better be talking about dynamics as well. There's lots of things in a function. The reason I show you this slide is that I want to emphasize it's not a boxology. A cognitive architecture is detail. Detail, detail, detail. It's not an implementation, but it has these representational and algorithmic details. Just as any system architecture would have. And it will show you what your data flows and your control flows are. And if you're lucky, it will also show you what your dynamics are, the behavior of the system, which is often left out of both system and cognitive architectures. Okay, you can't just add knowledge in an emergent one, so therefore you have to embed a value system. So you don't have rules in it, you've got dynamics, and it's very, very, very hard to identify those dynamics. So the dynamics arise because of interactions between the different ensembles of modules, ideally the whole system. And one of the biggest problems you're going to have is in an emergent system we have this thing called circular causality. The global system behavior influences the dynamics, which in turn determine that. You end up something which is hateful in mathematics, circularity, something we don't like. And we need to model these things mathematically if we're to understand them. So we need probably a better calculus than we have at the moment in order to model this. But it's a very, very topical area in a particular branch of cognitive architecture. It's not the one that I think that you'll be using much in ease, but at least be aware that it's out there and it is important. Maybe not now, maybe in 50 years' time. Okay, so back to my little taxonomy of cognition. So we have, for all of them, the organizational decomposition, the algorithmic formulations, all of these things. Over here, we need a framework for memories and learning, a programming mechanism, something to embed in knowledge. And over here, we're all about in skills, autonomy, and how to develop. And then in the middle, of course, you get both. There's lots of surveys. There's far, far too many cognitive architectures. That's the topic of the Wednesday class. What are we doing to reduce that diversity? Why can't we have a common model of cognition? And people are trying to do that. There's loads of them. We've got SOAR, EPIC, Icarus, Claire, COSI in the cognitive side. We've got Global Workspace, Darwin, Cognitive Affective. And then actually the most active area today is in the hybrid area. Clarion, which I'm going to talk a little bit about, CRAM, with some trepidation I'll mention. Actar, an embodied version of it, LIDA, and so there's many more. I mean, this is not exhaustive. So, checkpoint, pause, before getting into one. All still here? Good? All right. All right. I'm waiting someday in a class where students put on these glasses with open eyes and then put on their video recorder, and it will happen someday. So, SOAR, I have to begin with SOAR. SOAR is the granddaddy of them all. So SOAR began with Alan Newell, and it came out of, and this is important to know, SOAR came out of a department of computer science. That's crucial, right? And it's the grandfather of them all. And he was interested in the UTC, Unified Theory of Cognition. So his interests were far more wide-ranging than just computer science. He wanted it all. But this is where it came from. And it followed an approach where you've got memory, and both recognition memory and working memory. Effectively up here we have a set of rules. This is a rule-based system. And these rules are called productions in the literature. And these productions either fire or don't fire depending on the state of the values or the attributes in your working memory. And as they fire, things happen. The state changes. And it goes on and on. That's effectively how SOAR works. So it's very, very fine-grained. So there's a production cycle where you fire all the rules that you can, and then of all the ones, then there are a number of possible decisions, and then you select whichever one you want. So it's a lot deeper than that, but that gives you an idea of what it is. No, I can't say this on video. I would say if I wasn't being videoed, but it's a glorified for people who are good at reading. It's effectively a rule-based system, and there are lots of ifs and lots of elses, and that's basically it. However, that's not SOAR today. SOAR today, beg your pardon, there's lots of knowledge as well, different types of knowledge in the system, but SOAR today is growing. SOAR today just doesn't have procedural, well, this is their version of procedural. By procedural, they mean these rules which are driving it. It is semantic, it is episodic memory as well. I will talk about the nuances between these different types of memories tomorrow, just so you understand where they come from. They have completely different bases in neuroscience and completely different attributes. And actually today is setting the scene for things that I want to finish off tomorrow and Wednesday. So it's a much more embracing architecture than the original one. So we're up here now. This is John Laird, who carried on Newell's work along with others. I want to point out one very interesting about this diagram. I didn't draw it, I copied it. We've got perception, we've got action, we've got mental imagery. This is what Michael was talking about this morning, this idea of having some way of imagining what would be in the world and using that. So they're beginning to get this in here. But look, the body's completely different. It's purely a symbolic system here with input and with output, and your body has no impact on it. So there's no concept of a body schema. Don't need it. Right? Our knowledge is sufficient. I show you this one because this is what was drawn in their latest paper last year, and this is the topic of Wednesday. So this is just a little teaser about what we'll be doing on Wednesday. I'm not going to tell you, but look at the colors. The color is the key. Right? That's SOAR. ACT-R also came out of Carnegie Mellon University. By the way, I had these slides long before I joined CMU, so I have no particular affiliation with either ACT-R or SOAR. But it's interesting that two of the earliest ones did come out of CMU. This came out of psychology. This is John Anderson's one, ACT-R. And he has projected it onto various structures within the brain. Again, it's symbolic. Again, it's slightly, it's a production system, so it's effectively a decision-making system. And look, watch the colors. Spot the pattern. That's what I want you to do. I'm not going to tell you. You've got to spot the pattern. There'll be another one. Look, different colors, different types of things. The colors don't matter here, so forget that. Right? This is Icarus. This is Pat Langley, has been working in the field for years, so I just wanted to put up his one. Again, it's far closer to high-level abstract. There aren't a lot of formalisms in this. LIDA is one that's going to make, I think, a splash one of these days. It's been going for a long time. It's still being developed. And one of the things I show it is because, look, let me just show you the boxes. The colors don't matter here again. This hasn't been interpreted in that color scheme. Let's start here. We've got a sensory motor memory. With sensory memory, we've got action selection, which decides what you should do. We've got episodic memory. We've got procedure. You'd get the idea that memory is important, wouldn't you? And it is. And the point is you need to understand the different roles that different types of memory play in an architecture and how they interact with one another. So that's his architecture, and it's not finished. It's not completely working, but every year a new publication comes out. So this is Stan Franklin's work. So it's getting there. This is an architecture from many years ago, and I don't think it works anymore, but it's such an important architecture to show one hugely important issue. This is Murray Shanahan's work called Global Workspace, and the idea is that you've got a sensory cortex, you've got a motor cortex, your basal ganglia is the part of your brain which is responsible for decision making. You've got an amygdala, which is your affective part of your brain. It's sensitive to emotions, your affective state. And that's the first time I've mentioned emotion in the context of cognition. If you think that your decision processes are not influenced by your emotions, think again. They are. And if you want a good model, you better factor in the affective state into your cognitive system. And so you have then a loop between the world, your senses, your motor cortex, which is acting in the world, your basal ganglia has been modulated by your affective state, but look here, this is the big thing. You've got here an associative cortex and another associative cortex for your perceptions and your motor and your basal ganglia. Effectively, what you have here in this architecture is a little simulation circuit, emulating what might be happening. And it's not just if that happens, that and then that happens, that's a rule. This is a continuous loop going round and round, imagining what would happen if I pursued that action policy. As an architecture, it's got many, many parallel entities working, and one of them is asserted, and it then, for a period of time, controls the others. This is the idea of picking a state from multiple competing processes and pick one. So you pick the one, and then that's in control for a while. Okay. Darwin is one that Jeff Krishmar and Edelman put together. And it's like a neural network, but it's at a much higher level of abstraction. They're really more interested in what they call brain-based devices. So it's a simulated nervous system. It's not a deep learning system, which does not simulate any nervous system that I know. Well, deep learning is a magnificent testimony to the power of backpropagation through many, 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 many layers, so that you can learn the features rather than hand coding them. But it's not modular in the sense that it's not a graph of interacting modules, even if there are recurrent versions. It's still not a graph. This is much more like a graph of different aspects of your architecture. So they tried to be neuromimetic, and they tried to look at the nervous system as a whole. There are many, many Darwins. Here's Darwin X. So this is one which it developed episodic memory. Episodic memory is well, I better tell you what I'm going to tell you tomorrow. Episodic memory is your memory of your autobiographical memory, stuff that happened to me, including how I felt about it at the time. And it includes your spatial understanding. And the part of the brain that we use for spatial understanding is your hippocampus. So they were effectively modeling the hippocampus. 90,000 neural units, 50 areas. So, well, actually, I guess, yeah, we're up to 50 in deep networks, but it's not a deep learning neural network. It's different. And 1.4 million synaptic connections. This was, I mean, we're talking about 10 years ago, so that was pretty impressive then. But, the very opposite of ease, in the sense of your project. Look at this. This is your visual environment, yeah? That's not an everyday environment. So while it may exercise the architecture, it isn't ecologically plausible as an architecture. It hasn't been demonstrated to be, and you've got to watch that. Okay, one of my favorites, pause again. Hey, Isaac. So I like Isaac because as a boxology, it's not just a boxology, it works, it's been implemented, but as a boxology, it's brilliant because it actually is a lovely example of pretty much most of the things you'd want in a cognitive architecture. It was developed for, well, yeah, it's a robot. As they say in sorry, it's life, Jim, just not as we know it. We would like our robots to be better than this. But nonetheless, it was grounded in robotics. It wasn't just grounded in, well, let's see if it makes sense and I can get it published. And that's harder. So let me just go through the different aspects of it very, very quickly. Okay, the first thing is we've got an environment, we've got perceptual agent. It's an agent-based system, so multiple parallel asynchronous processes running and communicating asynchronously. We've got perception, we've got agent for all your different motor parts. You've got a first order response. This is important. You want to be able to react quickly without thinking. If you don't, you won't be able to do it. And you don't need to reason to do everything. On the other hand, then, in the main part here, we've got an attention network attending to what's particularly important in short-term memory. Long-term memory, hey, the three words again, semantic, procedural, and episodic. That's for tomorrow. But briefly, facts, stuff that happened to me, and know-how, skills. They're the three type of things that are encapsulated in that. And then you've got, and this is one of the reasons I showed, you've got an intention agent. So what am I intending to do? And affect, it also starts to build in the concept of, well, there may be an affective state. So some kind of artificial emotion. And then this one, and this one is so, so important, which is why I'm leaving it till last. I'm not going to talk about the central executive, but there is a central controller here, but this internal rehearsal system is one of the most important developments in cognitive architectures in the last 10 years. this concept, which is what Michael mentioned earlier on, this idea of imagining the future. There's a term which is used in the psychology literature. It's been used for about 10, 15 years. It's called episodic future thinking. I love it. I think it's a great term because it encaptures so much. It takes your episodic memories, your memory of your past, and then it allows you to think in the future. So that's what memory is about. Memory isn't about memory about the past. It's, as Michael said, it's about guiding action. That's what memory is there for. I don't have to give tomorrow's talk now. It's great. Okay, so it's a hybrid because it's got both symbolic and sub-symbolic. All of the agents operate asynchronously, so it's based up on all of these individual processes. We've got motion, we've got perception, the first response one that I mentioned. We've got short-term memory, long-term memory. There's my short-term. Long-term memory is stuff that well, is long-term, you reuse it. And then your working memory is what you're currently working on. The memory, effectively the state which represents the current task. The egosphere is effectively a representation of what's happening in the world around you, and then you can't work on everything, so you have an attention system. So that's critically important. Let's leave that till tomorrow. Okay, it's always good to say things twice, so I'll say it now and I'll say it again tomorrow. We've got two different types of memory. We've got declarative and we've got procedural. Knowledge and know-how. Skills and knowledge. Different types of knowledge. So your episodic memory is everything about your past history. Your goals, your emotions, your actions, and what value you attach to the outcome. And this helps you modulate your decisions. Okay. And the one thing actually that this doesn't say, and it should, episodic memory is flawed. Intentionally, not on purpose. Evolutionary, it's flawed. To be non-perfect is a good thing, it turns out. Okay, so there we have our working memory. Now I told you I was going to get to this wonderful part in every talk where I'll skip over the next few slides, and if you want the details, have a look at the notes on the website. Okay, so I'm not going to take you through that. Take you briefly into this book. This is Clarion. The take-home message here for anyone thinking about doing cognitive architectures for a PhD is don't. So Clarion and SOAR, I mean, if you looked at the dates, 1982, 1995, 2019, and they're still going. Clarion has been in the works, well, at least since 2003, and eventually, 13 years later, he managed to write the book about it. That tells you something. It's a huge, huge endeavor. Now, I usually finish off on Clarion for a very important reason, and that is because it is the only architecture I know which does the following. Good, I've got your interest, right? It does something special. It manages to combine both symbolic representations, symbolic processes, and sub-symbolic, and it does it effectively. I'll take you very briefly through how it does it. But it's one of the few that pays serious attention to this idea. We've got four effective centers or subsystems within Clarion. Action, non-action, metacognitive, and the motivational subsystem. Okay, so let me talk briefly first about the action. But before that, notice this. Explicit representation, implicit. Explicit, implicit. Symbolic, sub-symbolic, symbolic, sub-symbolic. And algorithms to allow the two to talk together. It's not just the boxology. It's not just saying, oh, I'd like it to happen. They've made it happen. So we have these four subsystems, and it's hybrid because it's got both the connectionist and the symbolic. Implicit at the bottom level and explicit at the top level for your knowledge representation. And it's got an ability to learn with or without domain-specific knowledge. It can do supervised learning, but it can also do self or unsupervised learning. Whoops, what have I done there? Nothing. We move on. Right? When you don't waste time on a slide that doesn't make sense. This is something that I've learned. Right. So just to give you a flavor of how this works, I can't do justice to the algorithm, but the idea is that you've got a percept X. And then you have all these possible actions that you could take. So there's always more than one option. and you would like to evaluate the quality of all these options. So you've effectively got an action policy. So based on your percept, based on the state of the world, what should you do? You'd like to estimate the quality of those actions. So this happens at the bottom level, and at the top level, you've also got a rule network. So it got all of these rules, and based on the input that's been sent up from the bottom, because perceptions come in, perception is sub-symbolic, it's not symbolic. That was the problem with AI 20, 30 years ago. Every AI researcher I knew and worked with thought that vision is easy. It's not. There's a great deal more to it than that. But ultimately, yes, you can abstract symbolic representations out of it. So the idea here is that you've got your bottom level actions, and you've got your action. You observe the action at the top level by enacting a rule. You measure the value of that, or how well it worked, and then these are used as feed down to the bottom level, and they're used in a reinforcement learning paradigm. So effectively, the outcome of the rule becomes your reinforcement, your Q learning algorithm, so that you can do reinforcement learning down here based on the outcome of the selected rule up there. And you can also extract rules from what's happened down here as well. So you can augment your rules up here based on the improved capacity of your bottom layer. Right, so you can do experiential hypothesis-based learning at the top level, and you can also do bottom-up level. So the take-home message here is that this takes very seriously the idea that you can do effectively rational learning, but you can also do experiential learning, trial by error, both with a neural connectionist approach and also with a rule-based system. And you can get them to work together effectively, that they can work collaboratively. So that's the important thing. So you've got bottom-up learning. Okay. Moving over quickly, we've got NACS, which is the non-action one. Effectively here, these are all of your memory networks. And explicit knowledge in symbolic form, and also in non-symbolic form. Sorry, I got this wrong. The motivational system is over here. This is on the wrong side. Move it over. This is the problem with modifying slides while Michael's talking. My attention was being distracted, so I wasn't checking. With apologies to Michael, of course, for being rude in the first place. So the idea of the motivational system, it provides you with your goals. And the other thing is then that the metacognitive system, this is important because this is thinking about thinking. I raise this idea here now because I'm going to show you another cognitive architecture in a second. We're doing okay. Still got a bit to go for lunch. And we've gotten through about 100 slides. So we're over halfway there. Right, so the metacognitive system then is thinking about thinking. It's the thing which is trying to improve your performance. It's looking at your performance overall, and as a system then, trying to see if it can develop a better strategy. That's going to come back in just a second when I show you my final cognitive architecture, which is this. And here, I'm on very thin ice, because this is your cognitive architecture, and so I put my hands up and say, it's an interpretation. That it is my view of it, it may not reflect your view. Michael's seen these slides before and I'm still standing, so at least it's close to the truth, if not the actual truth. It's a version of the truth, but not fake news, it's real. Let me give you, and this was based, I spent a very enjoyable 2 weeks here last summer, and I asked a lot of questions to a lot of people who were all probably very glad to see me leave. But this is what I learned, and I'd like to share it with you. This was the original drawing from Michael's original paperback. Gosh, it's hard to believe it was 8 years ago. And yeah, I read that paper many, many times and decided I'd like a different version. So I came up with this encapsulation. So this has never appeared in a CRAM publication. It has nothing to do with ease or to do with CRAM, it's to do with me. So if you don't like it, I'm the guy who created it. But anyway, let's see. It helps me to walk you through the different aspects of it and the different processes. Okay, so the first thing to note is it's got this thing called CPL, a CRAM plan executive. Planning is everything in this cognitive architecture. So But there's something really very beautiful about the way that these plans are constructed and formulated. So CPL has got an abstract plan. That's important. It's an abstract plan. It says, this is my plan in the abstract without being necessarily attached to a particular instance of enacting that plan. So we've got objects, we've got locations, we've got trajectories, everything you want for robot manipulation. But it requires resolution at runtime based on the current context. So these abstract designators are made meaningful at runtime through semantic context, through proprioceptive, what's the state of my body, and through exterioceptive, what's the state of the world. It's got interesting control structures. I like the fact that everything's done in parallel. When constraining something, you've got different steps which are executed. So execute those unless the constraints say you can't. That's the formalism. So here I have to admit something. I'm an engineer, software engineer by background, and I didn't get the formal AI training that I should have gotten in university. So when I look at something like that, I did write a Lisp program once, but it was back in 1974 or 75. So yeah, it's not as intuitive to me as other languages are. But then again, I'm now learning Python, and I don't think that's particularly intuitive either. So, but languages are languages. Once you become familiar with them, they become obvious. The semantics become transparent. It's just a familiarity thing. So that's the way that CPL looks. There's a bigger version of it. Now here's the key take-home message though, and this is what makes this particularly effective as a cognitive architecture. And I'll explain why in a moment. The idea is that when executing your plan, you take these abstract designators and you query then your available databases. And the databases are your NoRob, this is your, effectively your knowledge base for everything about what you know about the world. But you've also got a perception database and you've got an action executive. This is RoboSherlock and this is Giscard. So the point is, as you're executing your plan, you're resolving the ambiguities by looking to see what the current state is. And the current state could be anything in your memory, your past, or your projected future. That's important. So over here in the NoRob knowledge base, it uses OWL to specify the ontology or knowledge structure, Prolog for reasoning, and then Mongo for your database of your sensory motor traces. So we're going to keep a database of all of the things that we've been doing at a very low level of abstraction. You query NoRob through a query language. This is your ontology of your world, your worldview. And this is really important now. So this is the point where you need to sit up straight, pay attention, hands up, and if you've got a pen, put it between your teeth. Let me explain that. So in the embodied cognition world, it's been shown empirically, so this is evidence-based research results, that your mental state is modulated by your physical state, not the other way around. So if you position yourself, your stance, and if you do this, I'm on video, but I'm still going to do it. What you do is you activate the muscles you use for smiling. I kid you not, and it puts you in a good mood. And this is, if you want them, nobody ever believes me when I say this. So if you don't believe me, send me an email and I'll send you the paper. Okay, and it's true. And then the sitting up straight, these are your affective state is modulated by your physical disposition. Yep. So good. Now I have you back again. I can take you to this crucial part of the CRAM story. This idea that our episodic memory is central to everything. So it's like a video of an ongoing activity of your inner world knowledge base coupled with very detailed story about your actions and motions. This is effectively imagination made real for practical purpose. And then you have a concept called NEAMs. These are your narrative and named episodic memories. So you take experience, you take your narrative, and that effectively encapsulates what it is, how something might happen, based on your prior experience. It's crucial that you understand here that episodic memory in CRAM subsumes procedural memory. Remember I distinguished between know and know-how? Now typically, procedural memory in the neuroscience literature is not amenable to introspection. You can't think about the way well, you can think about the way you hit a tennis ball, but it's not going to do you a lot of good. Skills are skilled, and they're not amenable to, you can reason about it, but it won't have an impact. Same with a lot of other skills. Riding a bicycle. You can tell someone how to swim. That won't make them a good swimmer. Right? But here, though, something very important has happened in CRAM. We're rendering episodic memory as declarative knowledge instead of procedural. And that's done for a very, very important reason. It's done so that it makes it amenable to reasoning. It makes it a first-class object, and I can use both my procedural, my action, as well as my knowledge about the state of the world in my reasoning process. And that, I think, is one of the things that makes CRAM completely different. It gives it all its power. You've got an inner world, two forms, your current beliefs about yourself and the world, and then your internal simulation. I told you this was going to be important. And this is a cornerstone of CRAM as well. The idea that you can project future states, episodic future thinking, straight out of the psychology literature, in a working cognitive architecture. So we also have an inner world, and this is, as Michael was saying, this concept of physics engines and virtual reality engines are extremely powerful now. And while I would have objected to using simulations in the past effectively, today, I think Michael's right, we've gotten to the point where as long as they are realistic, that's the trick, as long as they're realistic, they can play a very, very important role as an explicit model of your world. So this is a simulation of your world. There are other ones as well, which are not used in the CRAM approach. Finally, we've got symbolic reasoning. This is a very important part of the probabilistic aspect of CRAM. So when people say things, as Michael mentioned this morning, they don't always include everything they should say in order for you to understand what they mean. Instructions are vague. And we dreamt up a term for it last year, semantically underdetermined. And you've got to resolve that underdetermined aspect of those semantic statements. And practice is part of the thing that does that. So it infers missing information from natural language instructions. We've got generalization and learning. So here we're trying to map episodic memory to semantic memory. So your episodic autobiographical memory, then to your semantic memory, as we'll emphasize again tomorrow, is knowledge about facts about the world. So you're trying to learn naive physics and common sense knowledge. Effectively, the process of generalization, which is what people do all the time. We are brilliant inductive entities. We take the particular, we postulate the general, we form a model, and then we either accept it, reject it, or modify it. And that's how we operate in the world. And then finally, we've got our internal simulation. That's your belief about your current state, your prediction here. So these are different layers which allow you to access these different aspects of NoRob. And a logic-based language as well. So you can interact with it, not just through knowledge query, but also through your logic interface. Okay, that's the entity description interface, if you want to query it about its knowledge. And then we have our action executive. Now this is more than just executing an inverse kinematic solution, saying do this. It effectively reasons about the trajectory as well. So there is a thing called motor cognition, which is focused specifically on adaptive trajectory generation. So in classical robotics, we know what our destination is, we know where we are, we do an inverse kinematic solution, and then you apply some interpolation and hope for the best. Or get a lot of free space around that. And so this is different. So you've got an adaptive parameterization of your trajectory. So it embeds procedural knowledge down here. And, well, what can I say about computer vision other than it's hard? It's hard to do in general. And, of course, deep learning has given us wonderful image classification, but there's more to classification. And Marcus Vince will be here later in the week, and he'll give you, I know it's a terrific course on robot vision because I asked him for it. Because I had to teach computer vision last semester, and so I built on top of it. But I'm familiar. I think I'm familiar with what he's going to be saying. If he's telling you new stuff, I'll be the first asking questions and getting it from him. And now finally, in CRAM, what have we got? We've got this box up here. This is cogito. This is the reasoning about plan. So if plan is the heart and soul of CRAM, then your ability to look at those plans and improve them is important. This is what we call metacognition. So this is the metacognitive aspect of a cognitive architecture. Transformational planning, transformational learning. So the idea is that you would like to improve strategies by mining for regularity among existing, either by recombination or by consolidation. And the entity that's used here is called a PEAM, your pragmatic everyday activity manifold. If you want someone to explain that, ask Michael. So the idea, though, is key, is that you have plans, you've observed how they've worked out, and then you see up here, is there any way that I can either recombine them, improve them, or consolidate them? That's the metacognition. Okay, so let's see how it does. It's hybrid, this is CRAM. It's got an architecture, it's got knowledge, it's got a cognitive model. It does an extraordinary job of finessing the symbol grounding problem. Michael alluded to it, but it's one of the hardest problems in AI, and the idea is if you've got a symbolic system, how do these symbols acquire any meaning? What do the symbols mean? And so that, and it's difficult because there's a mismatch in the level of abstractions. Symbols are at one level of abstraction, and the world is dirty, nasty, real, sub-symbolic, and you've got to map from one to the other. So how do you do that? And there's many, many approaches to doing it, but CRAM finesses the problem and says, well, I'm not going to assume that my symbolic system is complete. Remember I said that these were abstract designators. So effectively, my designators in my plan are semantically underdetermined, and they're made sufficient by querying your knowledge bases at runtime. So you've got all these three knowledge bases, your perception, your action, and all of your memories over here. So you go out and you take these semantically underdetermined plans and resolve them based on the current state of the world. So it finesses it. So these are vaguely defined, roughly stated, assumption-laden. This is exactly how we want to communicate with robots, by assumption. You know, we want to assume they know what we're talking about. And we're not good at defining what we want. We don't say what we mean most of the time. And this is the CRAM approach to resolving that. So it does well on the behavioral characteristics, it does well on ecological realism, it's specifically oriented on everyday activities, good for cognitive characteristics. Now you know why I did those ones. And it's got a commitment to formalism, and then some. It's well grounded in formalism and representations. And it did well on all of the 11 different industrial requirements that we identified in the Rocky U project. So that's CRAM. My interpretation of CRAM, and if my interpretation is flawed, I would love to have this opportunity this week to talk to people about that. There are lots of forums for cognitive architectures out there. BICA is one that I'm particularly interested in. This is biologically inspired cognitive architectures. Alexei Samsonovich is the person who's been driving that for several years. He's a champion of that particular cause. And UCognition, which is now the Society for Artificial Cognitive Systems in Europe, has also been running with the Cognitive Robot Architectures manifesto as well. There's an IEEE technical committee specifically on cognitive robotics, and I'm one of the co-chairs. I'm retiring this year because we turn people over. We don't want old blood, we want new blood. So we try to get young, energetic people to be in charge of this. But last year we were awarded the IEEE award for the most active technical committee. So take home from that is that cognitive robotics is important, and it's growing, and it's active. It's truly, I think, the tomorrow of robotics. And I'd love you to join if you're not already a member. Which takes me ahead of schedule to the end. This is my next talk. Thank you. course, now I'm sorry I took out all those slides, but no, I only took out a few, as you've seen. If you've got questions, I'd be happy to try and answer them. Yep, at the back.
Thank you for the talk. I actually have a lot of questions. I'm trying to figure out which one to ask first. So in the beginning, you tried to give us a short definition of cognition, and then you gave this long list of desiderata of cognitive architectures.
Yeah.
And these seem all over the place. So the first question actually is, what is the utility of this term, cognition or cognitive architecture, if we use it to talk about so many different things?
Yeah.
Why do we have this at all if it's so unspecific?
Well, it's not that it's unspecific, to be honest, it's that it's general. And that was the whole point about Newell's introduction of the term. Cognitive architecture for him was everything. So you're exactly right, it's all over the place, because it was intended to be all over the place. Whether or not there's order and structure in being all over the place is, of course, the key thing. And that's, I mean, in a sense, you've given me the motivation for what I decided to talk about on Wednesday as well. People have said, and literally they have said, we're all over the place in this community. Everyone's doing something different. There's too much diversity. Can we please consolidate it? Can we please rationalize? And so a couple of years ago, they had at the AAAI, they had a meeting, and they came up with this idea of having a standard model of the mind. And that's since this year, they're holding it in 2018, I think in Arlington, and they've decided a better title is a common model of cognition. And so the whole point of what I'll be talking about on Wednesday is to give you an understanding of where that is now, today, 2018, and this consolidation that they're trying to not impose, because it's consensus driven. So they're trying to get the community to arrive at some kind of a consensus of, well, what should be in a cognitive architecture. I'll talk more about that on Wednesday. So your criticism is well founded, and people recognize that, and trying to do something about it. And we can see even today, I mean, you could pick out common themes, throughout it. And the idea is now, can we identify some order within these common themes and make them our roadmap, our agreed cognitive architecture. So that's coming. Have I answered your question?
Yes, it actually also set up the next two ones. So.
Excellent.
So I was thinking, wow, these are all huge, these architectures. If I wanted to start from scratch,
yeah.
What would be the minimal set of features that I would have to have? And maybe combined, for my thinking count as a cognitive architecture.
Yeah.
And combined with that, if I take a system like Move It, which is just the motion planner, but actually if I really look into it, it does a lot. It has all types of memories. It thinks about what will happen in the future. You can plug different embodiments. You can even think about pick and place actions. Why is that not in cognitive architecture?
Can it anticipate the outcome of the actions?
Well, in the sense that things predict things, things will be at a position, I will be somewhere, the world will look in a different way, but yeah, in that sense, it can anticipate certain things.
Well, it's hard to know without looking at all of the details. But if a cognitive architecture, if you're ticking all of those boxes in my definition of what is cognition, then you can call it a cognitive architecture. But, and this is where you will have to defend yourself in the community, because you will then have to go back up, and the community will come back at you and they will say, does it do this stuff? So these are these nasty desiderata that you weren't particularly keen on because there was so many of them. And if you want a unified theory of cognition, then you've got to address these things as well. If that's not what you're interested in, if what you're interested in is making money, or publishing a pragmatic paper, or doing some brilliant engineering and actually solving problems, as opposed to doing, oh please, this is where I'm sorry maybe we should turn the video off. As opposed to doing psychology, then it's a different agenda. And this is what I'll also talk about on Wednesday, because I have the same issue. How you go about designing a cognitive architecture depends on what you want. If you were Maya Rudinak, and you were building Leia, effectively her adaptive wheeler. I don't think she once looked at any of these desiderata. She decided, she did use cases. She did many use cases. She decided what behavior she needed, and she designed a cognitive architecture or an architecture to do it. We did the same thing in the DREAM project. This was a robot project which was helping children with autism spectrum disorder. And the idea was we needed a system which would assist the psychotherapist in the thing. We didn't want all of this ecological realism, cognitive characteristics. We wanted a system which did what we wanted to do. And so we designed it a different way. And that's exactly the topic in the third class where I talk about, okay, here's the common model of cognition, but hang on a second, there are different ways you can go about designing a cognitive architecture. And to answer your question, is designed by desiderata or designed by use case? And you have a choice in that. So, and I'm not attaching a value to either one. I'm not making a judgment. It depends on what you want out of your career, effectively. Have I answered your second question?
Yeah.
Good. Michael.
Just a remark to that. So I guess in AI, in the Russell Norvig, there's a similar discussion whether a thermostat is a rational agent, right?
Yeah.
And I think it's kind of, and the answer there, I guess, is more or less, yes, you could look at it like that, but it's certainly not an interesting one.
Yeah.
And I think it's kind of similar along that line, right? So it's doing something, but I guess in moving, you already assume that problems are stated in the right formalism so that you can actually apply a particular suite of methods to that. And yes, so I would see it kind of similar.
I mean, I am not going to pretend that this is a perfect definition. And in particular, it's interesting that that definition of cognition is not the one that I contributed to this survey. Right? No, it's not. The one I put in, if you want to look it up, my definition there is that a cognitive system is an autonomous anti-entropy engine for reasons. That's what I'm interested in, because I come from a particular side of cognitive systems where I think it's about self-organization, ultimately. And so anti-entropy, creating order in the world around you. Why would you create order in the world around you? Because that allows you to predict stuff. We order stuff to enhance the power of our predictive capacity. And a lot of cognitive agents work that way. And I think that that's a deep principle for actually not just the behavior, but also the intrinsic underlying architecture by which they operate as a system. So that was my one, but this was a consensus-driven one. This was, in a sense, a stalking horse, which says, okay, I need to get a community to read the book, you know, and so let's agree. This is the one definition that no one's disagreed with. But the problem is it's purely functional. It says what, not how. And actually that's part of its strength as well, because it's not pejorative. It doesn't say you should do it this way. It just says functionally, these are the attributes we'd like you to be. Now, I think that building a system that does all that is actually quite tough, extraordinarily tough. And it's a big system, and the architecture is the blueprint for that. So it's inherently a complicated system, or a complex system as well. So there's no getting away from it. So, all right, a little story. A couple of years ago, I worked in, how many years? It's getting on for 7 or 8 years ago. I worked in Munich, in the Technical University, and there was a very bright PhD student who decided he was going to do his PhD in cognitive architectures. And I said, think about that. Well, he's a very, very bright man, and he's still doing it. Maybe that's, I just throw that out there. It's a big endeavor, and I think he's refined his thing. So I remember many years ago, I was working with people who were developing distributed operating systems when there were no such things. And one of the people who developed the first object request broker, Orbix, said the problem with this domain is that before you do anything, you have to do everything. You have to build a whole operating system within which to test your particular new approach. Either pick an existing one and do it there, or build a whole new one. And the problem is with cognitive architectures, we tend to build a whole new operating system, plus, every time. And there's a huge cost associated with that. And as you've seen, many people have been doing it. And they've been doing it for many decades. So that tells a story without me adding any gloss to it. I tried it. I spent 6 years as a part of the Robot Cub project, helping to design our cognitive architecture. Is it finished? No. Will it ever be finished? No. Am I working on it now? No. You know, at some point you stop hitting your head off the wall and say, okay, there's got to be other things to do. I still believe that these are fundamentally important, and that's why with CRAM, I think you're lucky. You've got a foundation on which to build. And it's a very, I think it's a remarkably strong one. I don't know of a better one, especially in terms of robot manipulation. Other people will do different types of manipulation in a different way and in a better way, but as a whole system, never ever underestimate the value of a complete system. It's hugely important, and it's hard won over years. It really is. Any other questions? Yes?
I have this idea that to be able to anticipate, you need to be aware of the effects of your actions. But I don't know if that's just like my idea or is something real, or if there is any other way to actually perform anticipation.
So I skipped a little bit in this. Obviously, I can't do the whole thing in an hour and a half. But there's this approach in cognitive architectures which decompose your action capability into inverse models and forward models. So the idea is that if I have a forward model, let me get this right. If I have an inverse model, I know what I want. I know what I should do to get it. And then if I have a forward model, if I do this, I know what the effect is. And so if you combine these together, then you can create a way of anticipating, a way of predicting the outcome of an action based on your prior experience, based on your knowledge. And if it's a good model, there'll be many options. There won't be just one outcome. There will be a number of possibilities. And then you invoke the famous process in cognitive architecture called action selection. Now, you can base the action selection based on some objective function, or you can base the decision based on an internal simulation, so that it's not just if I did that, but then if I followed it through, what would be the outcome? So the word you used was aware. I try very hard not to anthropomorphize things. I try not to talk about machine consciousness or any of that, or awareness. It really is what's a future state, and what's the most likely future state, and what possibilities are there, and choose the one which is closest to my goal or will get me to my goal. I'm just an engineer. That's the way I think. Have I answered your question?
Yeah, it's just that to know the meaning of these effects is very difficult, right?
Yeah, but if you look at that's what's happening in CRAM. It's working out what will be the thing. In fact, actually, I think you're even taking it further. You're learning from experience, but not real experience, from imagined experience. It's interesting that today there's a lot of work on dreaming, and it's being used as not a metaphor, but as a very real mechanism for bootstrapping abilities. And there's neuroscientific evidence for this. So your hippocampus collects all of the stuff that you've been doing during the day, and when you're asleep, I won't say uploaded, it's communicated to your neocortex. And your neocortex is the most wonderful unsupervised learning system in the world. It's why you have one. So it's taking all of this stuff and it's enacting this stuff and throwing out the stuff that doesn't matter and consolidating the stuff that does make sense. And that's happening on a daily basis. And that's not just me conjecture, that's Jane McClelland, very famous neural network and neuroscientific researcher. That was what he pointed out to us several years ago. So that idea that Michael mentioned this morning of imagination is now being carried out, and there's a couple of European projects specifically on using dreaming as a mechanism to bootstrap cognitive ability through this enactment without committing to the motors. But then you have to have a body schema. And that's what's missing from SOAR. No body schema. No concept of a body. Body not needed. There's another one I took out of this called Kiras, and they don't, it's all just about timing. The body matters. There's a whole other class on embodied cognition, but that's important. But if you do have it, then you're capable of perhaps doing reinforcement learning on an imaginary scenario using the game engine virtual reality scenario that Michael envisages. That's my understanding of it. It seems plausible. But that's the basis for it. I'll return to that when I talk about memory. That's tomorrow. We'll mention this idea of prospection and how you can use memory to think about the future. Memory is not about the past. Memory is about the future. That's the point of tomorrow. Okay? You're welcome.